The woman at the crossroads was not weeping quietly the way women did in church or at funerals, with a handkerchief pressed to the corner of one eye and a careful composure held together by pride. She was crying the way the land cried in a drought, with everything open and raw and nothing left to hold back. Wallace Boone saw her from a quarter-mile off, just a shape against the late afternoon sky, where the two dirt roads crossed each other out on the flats west of Amarillo, Texas, in the autumn of 1882. He had been riding since before dawn, heading back to the Harlan Ranch after delivering a string of horses to a buyer up near Tascosa, and the sun was pulling itself low and orange over the caprock, and the whole of the Texas panhandle was settling into that particular golden hush that came just before dark swallowed everything. He almost rode on. He told himself that later many times, with the particular self-awareness of a man who knows his own instincts well enough to know when they nearly failed him. He almost nudged his sorrel gelding, whose name was Cricket, to the right, and taken the longer road back, the one that looped wide around the crossroads and came in from the south. He had done it before when he spotted travelers who looked like trouble. The Panhandle in 1882 was not a place where a solitary rider went looking for other people's complications. There were cattle thieves working the Canadian River breaks, and there were men running from law in 3 territories who had the hollow-eyed look of those with nothing left to lose, and a man riding alone with a decent horse and a good saddle was wise to read the horizon carefully and choose his roads accordingly. But then he heard her. The wind brought it to him, not words, just the sound of a person unraveling at the seams, and something in the sound made it absolutely impossible to ride past. It was not a helpless sound, which was the strange thing about it. It was a furious sound, a sound with teeth. He pulled Cricket to a slow walk and came up to the crossroads with his hat pushed back and his hands easy and visible on the reins, the way you approached anything uncertain in that country. She was sitting on a travel trunk at the edge of the road, and the trunk was battered, with one of its brass latches broken and the leather straps holding the whole thing together out of stubbornness more than design. She had dark hair that the wind had pulled half out of its pins, and she wore a gray dress that had once been a finer dress and had been altered into something more practical, with the hem raised and the sleeves made shorter, and she had a shawl wrapped around her shoulders that she was gripping with both hands like it was the only solid thing in the world. She did not look up when he rode close. She just kept crying, and her shoulders shook, and the sound she made was the kind of sound a person only makes when they have run completely out of alternatives. Wallace brought Cricket to a stop about 10 feet from her and sat quietly for a moment. He took off his hat. He looked at the crossroads north, south, east, west, and saw nothing in any direction except the grass and the fading light and a hawk circling high to the south. He looked back at the woman. "Ma'am," he said. She did not look up. "Ma'am, I don't mean to intrude on your privacy, but it's getting late and this isn't a good stretch of road to be sitting on after dark." Still nothing, or rather still the crying, which was in itself a kind of answer. Wallace swung down from Cricket and looped the reins over the saddle horn, so the horse stood free but wouldn't wander. Cricket was well trained and ground-tied, and then he walked over to a flat-topped rock about 6 feet from the woman's trunk and sat down on it. Not close enough to crowd her, close enough that she would know she was not alone. He set his hat on his knee and looked out at the western horizon, where the sun was making its last dramatic effort before giving up the day entirely, and he did not say anything else. He just sat. That was what his grandmother had taught him, back in Missouri before the war had taken everything apart. She had been a quiet woman with a gift for the essential truth of things, and one of the truths she had given him was this: sometimes people do not need you to fix anything. Sometimes they just need you to stay. So he stayed. The hawk to the south made one more lazy circle and then disappeared behind the caprock. Cricket shifted his weight and blew through his nose. The sky turned from orange to rose to a deep and luminous purple that had no name in any language Wallace knew, and the first stars appeared above the eastern flat, And still the woman cried, and still Wallace sat. After a long while he judged it to be perhaps 20 minutes, though time moved differently in that kind of silence. The crying began to change. It lost some of its ferocity and became something softer, something tired, and then it became quieter, and then it was mostly breathing, the long, ragged breathing of someone coming back from a very far distance. Then she said, without looking up, "Why are you still here?" Her voice was rough from the crying, but underneath the roughness it was a good strong voice, the kind that was used to being heard. "Because it's not safe for a woman to be alone at a crossroads after dark in the Texas Panhandle," Wallace said. "And because you were crying like someone had taken everything from you, and I didn't feel right about riding past that." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What if I want to be alone?" "Then you can tell me to ride on and I will," he said. "I won't argue with you about it, but I wanted you to know first that you don't have to be alone if you don't want to be." Another silence. Then she finally lifted her head and looked at him, and Wallace felt something shift in his chest in a way that had nothing to do with anything he could readily name. She had a face that was striking rather than conventionally pretty, strong cheekbones and dark brows and eyes that were brown and very direct, swollen now from the crying but still entirely clear in their gaze. She was perhaps 25 or 26, he guessed, though grief had a way of adding years to a face. She looked at him the way people looked at things they were not sure they could trust but wanted to. "You're a cowboy," she said. It was not quite a question. "Wallace Boone," he said. "I work for the Harlan Ranch about 12 miles south of here, horse management mostly." "Grace Conley," she said. And then, as if the name itself reminded her of something she had nearly forgot, she pressed her lips together and looked away toward the north road. "Where were you headed, Miss Conley?" he asked. "It's Mrs.," she said. Then very quietly, "It was Mrs., I'm sorry," he said, and he meant it without ceremony. "My husband died 4 months ago," she said. "Thomas Conley. He had a ranch outside of Mobedy. 30 head of cattle and a house he built himself, and about $300 of debt to the First Bank of Wheeler County." She said it all flatly, like she was recounting inventory. "The bank took the cattle and the land and the house. I had $40 and a trunk full of clothes and a letter from my cousin in Lubbock saying I could come stay with her." She looked at the trunk. "I was on the mail coach from Mobedy. Driver let me off at the Crossroads because I was supposed to be meeting my cousin's husband with a wagon. He was supposed to be here at 3 o'clock. She looked at the sky, which was now fully dark except for the lingering twilight in the west. "It is considerably past 3 o'clock. "Yes, ma'am," Wallace said. "It's closer to 7. "I know." She pulled the shawl tighter. "I've been sitting here for 4 hours telling myself it was fine, that he was just delayed, that everything was going to be fine." She stopped, and then I stopped being able to tell myself that, and she made a short gesture with one hand that meant the rest was self-evident. "That's a hard day," he said. She gave a short laugh that had very little humor in it. "It's been a hard 4 months. I expect it has." She looked at him again, that same careful, assessing look. "You're not going to tell me it'll all work out, or that God has a plan, or that Thomas is in a better place?" "No," he said. "I'm not going to tell you any of those things." "Good," she said. "I've heard all of them until I want to scream. I imagine." The stars were coming out in earnest now, thick and close the way they were only out on the flat open plains where there was nothing between you and the sky. A coyote called from somewhere to the east, and another answered from the south, and the night wind began to carry a real chill. Wallace stood up and went to his saddlebag and pulled out his bedroll blanket. He always carried it even on single-day rides, a habit from years of things not going as planned, and he brought it over and held it out to her. "It's clean," he said. She looked at the blanket and then at him, and then she took it. She wrapped it around her shoulders over the shawl without any ceremony or particular thanks, and he did not require any. He went back to his rock. "You should ride on," she said. "You have somewhere to be." "The ranch will be there in the morning," he said. "Mr. Harlan is particular about his horses, but he's a reasonable man about delays. I'll send word with anyone passing south. You don't have to stay on my account." "I know I don't." She stared at him. He held her gaze steadily. "You're a strange man, Mr. Boone," she said. "I've been told that," he agreed. She was quiet again for a while, but it was a different kind of quiet now, less like a person alone and more like two people choosing not to speak, which is an entirely different thing. Wallace pulled a piece of jerky from his coat pocket and offered her half. She shook her head, then changed her mind and took it. "How did Thomas die?" he asked after a while. He asked it quietly, not as a prying question, but as an honest one, the way you asked about something that mattered. She was quiet for a moment. "Horse threw him," she said. "He hit his head on a fence post. He died the next morning. He didn't suffer long." She said the last part like it was something she had practiced saying so it wouldn't break her open. "He was 32 years old. We'd been married 3 years. Children?" he asked. "No," she said, and that one word carried an entire world of something in it. "I'm sorry," he said again. "Stop apologizing," she said, but not unkindly. "You didn't do any of it." "No, but it still happened, and I'm still sorry it did." She looked at him for a moment with something shifting in her expression, some subtle softening around the eyes. "You're not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" "Cowboys don't usually sit down on rocks and stay," she said. "Usually they ride past or they try to help in a way that's really just them telling you what to do." "I've done plenty of telling people what to do," he said. "It doesn't generally solve anything." She almost smiled. It didn't quite make it to a full smile, but the corners of her mouth moved, and that was something. They heard hoofbeats about an hour after full dark had settled over the flats. A single rider coming from the south at a trot, with a lantern on a pole attached to the saddle, an older man on a stocky gray mule, and he pulled up at the crossroads and lifted his lantern and said, "Grace Conley." She stood up immediately. "Yes, I'm here." The man climbed down slowly with the stiff care of someone whose knees had been giving him trouble for years. "Beg your pardon, ma'am. I'm Eli Parsons, married to your cousin Margaret. I am truly sorry for the delay. One of my wheel spokes cracked on the way out and I had to go back to town for a new one. I should have sent word somehow, but there wasn't anyone going this direction." He saw Wallace and nodded warily. "Who's this?" "Wallace Boone," Wallace said, standing and putting his hat back on. "Harlan Ranch. I came across Mrs. Conley while she was waiting and kept her company." Eli Parsons looked at him a moment longer, taking his measure the way older men in that country did, looking at the quality of the boots and the eyes and the set of the jaw. Then he nodded, apparently satisfied with what he found. "That was good of you," he said. Wallace loaded Grace's trunk onto the back of Eli's wagon. There was a wagon left up the road. It turned out, not far, with more ease than the thing deserved given how heavy it was, and he brought Cricket around and stood at the side of the wagon while Eli climbed up to the seat. Grace paused before she climbed up. She still had Wallace's blanket around her shoulders. She held it out to him. "Thank you," she said, "for staying." He took the blanket and folded it over his arm. "It was my pleasure, Mrs. Conley." She looked at him, and there was something in her face that was hard to read, something searching, something not quite finished. "You never asked me what was wrong," she said. "You just sat there. I figured you'd tell me what you wanted me to know. Most people would have asked." "Most people want an answer they can work with," he said. "I didn't think this was that kind of problem." She held his gaze for a long moment, and then she said quietly, "My name is Grace, not Mrs. Conley, just Grace." "All right," he said. "Then I'm just Wallace." She nodded once like something had been decided, and then she climbed up beside Eli and the wagon pulled away south, the lantern swinging, the darkness swallowing them up. Wallace stood at the crossroads for a while after they were gone, looking at where the wagon lights had disappeared. Cricket nosed at his shoulder. "I know," Wallace said to the horse. "Let's go home." But he thought about her the whole 12 miles back. Lubbock in 1882 was a new town, barely more than a collection of ambitions gathered around a water source on the flat South Plains, and Margaret Parsons, Grace's cousin, was a stout and cheerful woman who had married a stout and cheerful man, and together they had built something that worked. They had a solid frame house on the edge of town, a general store that Eli ran, and 2 boys, aged 8 and 10, who made enough noise for 6. Margaret welcomed Grace with genuine warmth and an absolute absence of pity, which was the only kind of welcome Grace could have stood. "You'll sleep in the back room," Margaret said, unpacking Grace's trunk with the brisk efficiency of someone who believed in practical action as the best response to grief. "You'll eat with us. When you're ready to work, there's plenty to do at the store. When you're not ready, no one will push you." "I'm ready to work," Grace said immediately. Margaret looked at her over the trunk. "Grace, you've been a widow for 4 months, you just sat alone at a crossroads for 4 hours in the dark, and you're still wearing the same dress you left Mobetty in, which appears to be the dress you also slept in last night." Grace opened her mouth. "Sleep first," Margaret said firmly. "Work after." Grace slept for 14 hours. When she woke up, it was mid-morning and the house was quiet. Eli was at the store, the boys were at school, and Margaret was in the kitchen making bread, and the smell of it came through the house like something healing. Grace sat up in the bed in the back room and looked at the ceiling, which was plain pine board, and she said to herself, very quietly, "All right." It was not an answer to anything specific. It was more of an agreement with herself to continue forward. She went and washed her face and put on a clean dress and went to find Margaret, and Margaret poured her coffee and put a plate of food in front of her and didn't say a word, just let the morning happen around her. It was not a bad way to begin again. Over the following weeks, Grace settled into the rhythm of Lubbock and the Parsons household with the careful deliberateness of a person who knows they are building something from the ground up and had better pay attention. She worked in the store, which she discovered she was good at. She had a head for numbers and a natural ease with people that Thomas had always said was her best quality, and she liked the work because it kept her hands busy and her mind engaged and left less room for the kind of thinking that led nowhere good. She also, in the quiet of the evenings when Eli sat with his pipe and Margaret sewed, and the boys argued about everything with the thoroughness of people who consider argument a hobby, thought about the man at the crossroads. She thought about the way he had simply sat down, the way he had not crowded her or tried to manage her or offered her the particular kind of false comfort that was really just the giver's discomfort looking for an exit. She thought about his face in the starlight, not a pretty face, but a good one, weathered and honest, with light gray eyes that seemed to have arrived at some private accommodation with the world and were mostly content with the terms. She thought about the blanket, which had smelled of horse and wood smoke, and something else she could not name, some essential quality of a person. She told herself it was nothing. Gratitude, the outsized feeling that came from being at one's lowest and having someone kind appear. It meant nothing beyond what it was. She told herself this with great conviction several times, and then she stopped telling herself anything about it and just let it sit in the back of her mind like a stone in a river, smooth and quiet. It was Eli who mentioned the Harlan Ranch first, about 3 weeks after she arrived, in the context of a supply order the ranch sent into the store every month. "Good account," Eli said. "Pay prompt. Got a fine bunch of men working there." "Harlan is the horseman?" Grace asked, keeping her voice entirely neutral. "Horseman is one of his men," Eli said. "Fellow named Boone. Best horse hand in the panhandle, they say. He brought in a string of Mustangs last spring that were so well gentled you'd have thought they were born in a parlor." He shrugged and went back to his ledger. Grace went back to her own work and said nothing. 2 weeks after that, on a clear November morning, with the first real cold of the season putting a bite in the air, the Harlan Ranch supply wagon came into town. Grace was sweeping the front steps of the store when it pulled up, and she recognized the sorrel horse tied to the back of the wagon before she recognized the man driving it, because she had spent more time looking at the horse than she had admitted to herself. Wallace Boone climbed down from the wagon seat and tied the team to the post and looked up and found her looking at him, and for a moment they just stood there, two people surprised by the same thing. Then he took his hat off. "Mrs. Conley," he said. "Grace," she corrected. Something shifted in his face, a small warmth. "Grace," he said. "I didn't know you were in Lubbock." My cousin Margaret is Eli Parsons' wife. This is their store. She gestured at the building behind her. I see. He looked at her for a moment with those level gray eyes. How are you? It was a simple question, but he asked it the way he had sat at the Crossroads, with real attention, without hurry, as if the answer genuinely mattered and he had all the time in the world for it. Better, she said, and then, because it was true and because something about this man made the truth easier. Some days better than others, but mostly better. That's good to hear, he said. He meant it. How is cricket? She asked. He blinked, apparently not expecting that. Then he smiled, and it was the first full smile she had seen from him, and it changed his whole face entirely, made it younger and warmer and genuinely delighted. He's right there, he said, nodding at the sorrel. He's fine, stubborn as ever about creek crossings. He looked like a horse with opinions, Grace said. He has opinions about everything, Wallace said. He especially has opinions about creek crossings and about other horses who get more attention than he does. She smiled back, and it was a real smile, the kind she had not realized she had been saving. He came into the store then to collect the Harlan order, and Margaret, who had been watching the whole exchange through the window with an expression of serene calculation that Grace did not notice, until later helped him load everything into the wagon with chatty efficiency. And somehow in the course of that loading and the settling of accounts, it was arranged that Wallace would stay for the noon meal before riding back. Grace had the distinct feeling that she and Wallace had both been managed, and that Margaret was entirely pleased with herself, and she found she could not object very strenuously. The noon meal was the four of them. Margaret had sent a boy to call Eli back from the storeroom, and the two Parsons boys who came home from school for dinner, and who immediately decided Wallace Boone was the finest thing to happen to their dining table in recent memory. The older one, whose name was Robbie, asked him 14 questions about horses in the first 5 minutes. The younger one, Pete, asked if he had ever shot a man. Pete, Eli said. That's all right, Wallace said. No, I haven't. I've shot at men, which is a different thing, and I've been shot at, which is not pleasant, but in general I try to stay out of situations that require guns. But you have one, Pete said, looking at the Colt at Wallace's hip. I do, and I know how to use it, but a gun is a tool for last resorts, and a man who reaches for his last resort first is a man who hasn't thought very hard about his other options. Pete considered this with the grave seriousness of an 8-year-old confronted with wisdom. That's smart, he said, and went back to his food. Grace was watching Wallace from across the table. He ate the way he did everything else, without fuss, with attention, without performing anything for anyone. He listened to Eli talk about the store's supply chain with what appeared to be genuine interest. He complimented Margaret's cooking with such specific sincerity. The gravy has got sage in it, doesn't it? My mother used to do that. That Margaret beamed at him. He helped clear the table afterward without being asked. When he left, he shook Eli's hand and thanked Margaret and nodded to the boys, and then he looked at Grace and he said, I'm glad you're doing better. I'm glad you sat down on that rock, she said. He nodded once, the way he had at the Crossroads, like something had been decided, and he put his hat on and went to his wagon. Grace stood on the porch and watched him drive away, and when she turned around, Margaret was standing in the doorway with an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral and failing completely. Not a word, Grace said. I didn't say anything, Margaret said. You were thinking very loudly. I was thinking that he has good manners and kind eyes and that the way he looked at you was extremely interesting. Margaret, I'm just saying. Thomas has been gone 5 months, Grace said. Margaret's expression shifted into something gentler. I know, she said. I'm not rushing you. I'm just saying that the way that man looked at you was extremely interesting. Grace went back inside and picked up her work and did not think about it. She thought about it constantly. December came in cold and clear, with a norther blowing down from the caprock that had teeth in it, and the town of Lubbock went about its business with coats buttoned and hats pulled low. Grace had by now become a fixture in the Parsons store, and she had developed the particular satisfaction of competence, the pleasure of knowing a job well and doing it efficiently. She handled the accounts, managed the inventory, dealt with the supplier's paperwork, and occasionally helped customers with a directness that some of them found startling and most found refreshing. She also, when no one was watching, allowed herself to look forward to the Harlan Ranch supply days. They came every 2 weeks or thereabouts, and sometimes Wallace drove the wagon himself, and sometimes he sent one of the other ranch hands. When he came himself, he always stayed a little longer than strictly necessary. He would help load the wagon, and then somehow the loading would turn into conversation, and the conversation would drift from the practical to the general, and once or twice it drifted all the way to the personal. She learned that he was 30 years old and had been born in Missouri, that his parents had died in the war, his father at Wilson's Creek in 1861, his mother of fever the following winter, and that he had been raised by his grandmother until he was 16, when she had died too, and then he had simply come west because there was nothing left in Missouri to stay for. He had worked cattle in Kansas, horses in New Mexico, and finally fetched up in the Texas Panhandle 5 years ago, where the wide flatness of the land had suited something in him that he found hard to explain. "I think it's because you can see everything coming," Grace said one afternoon in mid-December, standing on the porch of the store in the cold sunshine while Wallace leaned against the wagon and drank the coffee Margaret had brought out. He looked at her. "What do you mean?" "On the flats. You can see for miles. Nothing sneaks up on you." She looked out at the brown winter plain stretching away to the north. "I think I understand that. Is that why you came out here? From where?" "Tennessee originally. I was born in Nashville. But I came out here because Thomas came out here and I came with Thomas." She was quiet a moment. He had this idea that the Panhandle was the last place in America where a man with nothing could build something. He read about it in a newspaper and made up his mind in about 10 minutes. She smiled a little. "That was Thomas. He always made up his mind very fast. And you came with him." "I believed in him," she said simply. "He was a good man. He worked hard and he was honest and he never stopped working toward what he believed in." She looked down at her hands. "It just didn't work out the way either of us planned." "Does it ever?" Wallace said. "No," she said. "I suppose it doesn't." He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "You don't seem like a woman who follows." "What do you mean?" "You said you came because Thomas came. But everything else I've seen of you, the way you run this store, the way you talk, the way you are, you don't seem like a woman who does things because someone else decides them." She considered that. "I chose to come because I chose him," she said. "That's different from following. I knew what the Panhandle was. I knew it was hard country. I made the choice." "That's what I mean," he said. "You knew and you chose. That's not following, that's deciding." She looked at him for a long moment. "You see things carefully," she said. "I try to," he said. "Most men don't. Most men are in a hurry," he said. "I've never seen the use of being in a hurry about the important things." The cold wind came up then, sharp and direct, and Grace pulled her coat tighter, and Wallace set down his coffee cup and said he had better get back before the norther came in full, and she said yes, he'd better, and they said their goodbyes with the careful courtesy of people who have said more than the words and know it. She went inside and Margaret looked at her and very wisely said nothing at all. On Christmas Eve, Eli Parsons organized a community supper in the largest of Lubbock's 2 church buildings, which was a practical response to the fact that the town was small enough that everyone knew everyone and the winter dark came early, and there was something to be said for gathering. There was food from every household in some contribution pies and roasted meats and preserved things in jars and dried fruit and sweet bread. And there was fiddle music and the particular warmth that comes from a lot of people in a small space choosing to be glad. Grace had not expected the Harlan Ranch men to be there. The ranch was 12 miles out, which was not nothing on a winter night, but several of them had ridden in, cleaned up and in their best shirts, and Wallace was among them. He found her near the food table about an hour into the evening, and he was holding a tin cup of cider, and his hair was combed, and there was something about seeing him in the lamplight of the church rather than in the flat outdoors that made him look different somehow, not less himself, but more specifically himself, the details more visible. "Merry Christmas, Grace," he said. "Merry Christmas, Wallace," she said. They ate together, standing at the side of the room while the parson's boys chased each other, and the fiddle played something lively and old, and the good warmth of a winter gathering moved through the room like something generous. They talked for a long time, not about anything momentous, about the food, about the music, about a story Wallace told about a horse he had once trained who was afraid of geese specifically and nothing else. It made her laugh, a real laugh, fully unguarded, and when she heard herself do it she was surprised by it, by how easy it was. After the supper, when the evening was winding down and people were gathering their coats, Wallace walked with her to the door, and they stood together on the step of the church in the cold night air where the stars were ferocious and brilliant overhead. "I want to ask you something," Wallace said. He was looking at the stars, not at her, which she recognized as the particular habit of someone who found things easier to say when they were not being watched while they said them. "All right," she said. "I'd like to come courting," he said, "if you'd allow it. I know it's only been 5 months since Thomas died, and I know that might be too soon, and I know you might not." He stopped. Started again. "I'm not going to pretend I don't care because I think you know I was lying and I think you deserve better than that. So I'm just asking, directly." Grace looked at the stars for a moment. She thought about Thomas, who had always deserved her best honesty and had gotten it, and whose memory she would carry gently and privately all her life. She thought about the crossroads and the rock and the blanket, and the way this man had sat in the dark with her and asked nothing and stayed anyway. "Thomas would have liked you," she said. "He had a very accurate nose for people. He would have called you a straight shooter, and he would have meant it as high praise." Wallace was quiet. 5 months is not very long," she said, "and there are people who would say it's too soon. I might say it myself some days." She looked at him. "But the truth is that this is the Panhandle in 1882, and I don't know what the rules are supposed to be, and I don't think I care very much. I think the truth is that you are one of the best people I've encountered, and I would like to know you better." He looked at her now, that direct gray look. "So yes," she said, "you can come courting." He smiled, that full, whole-face smile that changed everything about him, and he looked so pleased and so genuine in his pleasure that she felt something warm move through her that she had not expected. "I'll be here next Sunday," he said. "I'll be here," she said. He rode 12 miles back to the Harlan Ranch in the cold Christmas Eve night, and he was not cold at all. January came in hard, the way Januaries on the Panhandle did brutal blue northers, ground frozen solid, the kind of cold that was not dangerous if you were prepared for it and was extremely dangerous if you were not. Wallace came into town every Sunday without fail, riding Cricket through whatever weather the week had produced. He always arrived at the store around mid-morning, tied Cricket properly in the livery, and spent the day in Grace's company. They walked when the weather allowed, which was not always. They sat in the parson's parlor when it did not, playing cards with Eli and Margaret or reading aloud to each other in turns from the books that Grace had brought in her trunk from Mobedy, a battered Shakespeare, a volume of Dickens, a King James Bible that had been her mother's. Wallace was a good reader, slow and precise, and he had opinions about Dickens that made Grace laugh. "He goes on," Wallace said one Sunday afternoon, looking at an open page with mild exasperation. "He's Dickens," Grace said. "Going on is his whole thing. I understand that, but does he have to go on quite this much about this particular fence? It's not about the fence, it's about what the fence represents." Wallace looked at the fence description again. "What does it represent? The constraints of Victorian society and the ways in which the working class is. Are there horses in this book?" "Wallace, I'm just asking." She took the book from him and read the next chapter while he listened, and she could tell from the way he was listening that he was actually engaged, that the asking about horses had been a joke, and she liked that about him, that his humor was dry and quiet and came out sideways, unexpectedly, and was never mean. She learned his history in pieces, the way histories were told between people who were learning each other carefully. She learned about the grandmother who had raised him after his parents died, a woman named Ruth Boone who had kept a small farm in Missouri with a ferocity that had impressed even the war, which had taken everything around her and left her farm standing through sheer apparent respect for her determination. He had loved her deeply. He did not use those words, but Grace heard them anyway in the way he spoke about her. He learned her history in pieces too. He learned about Nashville and the family that had been solid and decent and conventional, and the aunt who had disapproved of Thomas because he was a Western dreamer with no money, and the way Grace had married him anyway, at 22, because she believed in him, and because she had always been more interested in what people might become than in what they currently were. He learned about the 3 years in Mobedy, which had been genuinely happy years despite the hardness of them, and the morning Thomas had gone out to repair the fence on the north pasture, and the afternoon the neighbor had come to the door with his hat in his hands. "Were you happy out there?" he asked her once on a gray January afternoon. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "It was hard, but yes, we were building something, we knew what we were working toward." She was quiet. "I think that's what I miss most, not just Thomas, though I miss him very much. I miss knowing what we were building toward." He nodded slow. "And now," she looked at him. "Now I'm figuring that out again," she said. "One day at a time." He looked at her steadily and said, "You'll figure it out. You've got more backbone than anyone I've ever met." "That's a strange compliment," she said. "It's the truest one I know how to give," he said. February arrived, and with it the particular quality of light that came to the Panhandle in the middle of winter, when the sky was an impossible pale blue and the cold was still sharp, but the sun was back at a higher angle, and something in the land began to remember that spring was a real thing that happened. Grace had been in Lubbock for 3 months, and she had made herself a life there, a small, careful, scaffolding life, but real. She was essential to the store. She had made friends. There was Dorothea Vance, the school teacher, who had good, strong opinions about literature and politics and was not afraid of either, and Clara Briggs, whose husband ran the livery and who was one of those women who had a gift for quiet companionship, and the company of these women made the fabric of her days richer. But the Sunday visits with Wallace were the thing she found herself looking toward all week. She was honest with herself about this. She had been married to an honest man and it had made her honest, and she applied the same honesty to her own heart. She was falling in love with Wallace Boone. She was doing it carefully and with full awareness of everything that had come before, but she was doing it, and there was no real point in pretending otherwise. On the 3rd Sunday of February, they were walking along the south edge of town, where the land opened up flat and wide, and the afternoon sun was making long gold shadows on the brown winter grass, and Wallace was telling her about a young horse he was working with at the ranch, a 3-year-old gray that had come in from the wild with about as much trust in humanity as a cactus. He was describing the particular patience required to win the horse's confidence, the stillness, the consistency, the waiting, the slow approach, and Grace was listening, and she was also thinking that he was describing, without knowing he was doing it, exactly what he had done with her. "You're doing the same thing," she said. He stopped and looked at her. "What do you mean?" "With me, what you described with the horse, the patience, the not pushing, the just being there." She held his gaze. "That's what you did at the Crossroads. That's what you've been doing since." He was quiet for a moment. A hawk was riding the cold updraft above the plain. "Is that all right?" he asked. "It's the only reason it worked," she said. He was still looking at her, and the afternoon light was very clear, and the wind had gone quiet for a moment in the way the Panhandle wind occasionally did, as if it too was paying attention. "Grace," he said. He stopped. "Say it," she said. "I think you are the finest woman I've ever known," he said. "And I want to be with you, not just on Sundays. I want to build something with you." "I know it's a big thing to say, and I know the timing is what it is," she said. She stepped toward him, which was a deliberate thing, and she put her hand on his coat lapel, which was a more deliberate thing still. "Wallace." "Yes," he said. "Stop apologizing for the timing," she said. He looked at her hand on his lapel, and then he looked at her face, and something in his expression opened up in a way she had not seen before. Something that had been kept carefully inside now allowed out into the February light. He put his hand over hers on his lapel. "All right," he said. "I love you," she said. She said it plainly, because she was a plain-spoken woman, and because there was no point in being otherwise about something this important. "I know that might be fast. I know I was at a crossroads 6 weeks after my husband died being found by a stranger. But I think you've been the most honest person I've known in a long time, and I think you see me very clearly, and I think I love you." He exhaled. It was not a dramatic exhale. It was the exhale of a man who has been holding something carefully for a long time and is now permitted to put it down. "I love you too," he said. "I have since the crossroads. Maybe not right at the beginning, but by the time the stars came out. I looked over at you, and you were still sitting there with my blanket, and you had stopped crying, and you were looking at the stars like you were having a very serious argument with them. And I thought, that's a woman I want to know." She laughed, and the laugh became something else, something softer, and he reached up and touched her face with his free hand, just the edge of his thumb along her cheekbone, and she leaned into it the way the gray horse probably leaned into his hand when it finally decided to trust him. "I would like to marry you," he said. "When you're ready. No rush. I'm not going anywhere." "I know," she said. "That's one of the things I love about you." He kissed her then, in the February sunlight on the edge of the Panhandle Plain, with the hawk still riding its invisible updraft above them and the winter grass gold and still around their feet. And it was a careful kiss, deliberate and honest, exactly like the man. They told Margaret and Eli that evening, back at the house, and Margaret said, "Well, finally," with such feeling that Eli shook his head. And Robbie wanted to know if Wallace was going to live with them, and Pete asked if Cricket was going to live with them. And the resulting chaos of children and explanations and supper all happening at once was one of the happiest evenings Grace could remember in a very long time. They set the date for April, not because anyone required such speed, but because the Panhandle spring was real and beautiful and short, and Grace had decided that if she was going to begin a new life, she would begin it with the land in bloom. But March brought complications, as March in the Panhandle was wont to do. A man appeared in Lubbock at the beginning of the month, riding in from the east on a hard-used horse, with a look about him that made the more experienced residents of the town straighten up and pay attention. His name was Gerald Hoff, and he said he was a creditor from the First Bank of Wheeler County, and he claimed that Thomas Conley's debts, which Grace had been told were settled by the bank's seizure of the property, had not in fact been fully settled, and that there remained a balance of $230 that Grace, as Thomas's widow, was legally responsible for. He came to the Parsons store with the paperwork, which he spread on the counter while Grace stood on the other side, and read every word of it with the careful thoroughness of someone who had always been good with numbers and documents. "This is not legitimate," she said, when she had finished. Hoff was a thin man with a smooth manner that had a hardness underneath it. "Ma'am, I assure you the bank took the property. The property was valued at $320 when Thomas purchased it, plus the cattle, which were valued at over $400. The total assets seized more than covered the total debt." She set the papers back on the counter and looked at him. "This claim is either an error or it is fraud, and based on the way you are looking at me right now, I suspect it is fraud." Hoff's smooth manner flickered. He gathered the papers back up. "I'd advise you, ma'am, to consult a lawyer before making accusations." "I'd advise you the same," she said. He left. Grace immediately sat down and wrote a letter to the lawyer in Mobedy who had handled Thomas's estate, a reliable man named Curtis who had been honest with her about everything. She also told Wallace on his next Sunday visit, and what followed was one of the things she would always remember about him. He did not immediately say he would handle it. He did not tell her what to do. He sat across from her at the parson's kitchen table and read the letter she had already drafted and said, "This is good. Add in the specific dollar amounts of the assets seized, because the more specific you are, the less room there is for confusion." She looked at him. "That's it. You're not going to ride to Mobedi and confront him?" "No," he said. "You've already handled it correctly. Why would I redo what's already done right?" She revised the letter with his suggestion and sent it off. Curtis replied within the week. The bank's claim had no legal standing, and the paperwork Hoff had presented appeared to have been altered after the original closing. Curtis had already reported the matter to the sheriff in Wheeler County. Hoff, who had been running a scheme against several widows in the region by presenting them with fraudulent debt claims and collecting on the ones too confused or frightened to dispute them, was subsequently arrested. Wallace read the letter from Curtis and nodded once with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had never doubted the outcome. "You handled that well," he said. "We handled it," she said. "You did the work. You told me to add the specific dollar amounts. That was a small thing. Small things matter," she said. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. "You've always known that." He turned his hand over under hers and held it. That April in the Texas Panhandle was everything Grace had hoped it would be. The land, which spent most of the year in various states of brown and tan and dusty gray, woke up in April with a brief and extravagant generosity. The wildflowers came across the flats in spreads of yellow and blue and red, and the grass came in green, and the sky was that particular shade of April blue that existed nowhere else. The wind was warm instead of cold, and the days were long and clear. On the 15th of April, 1883, in the Lubbock church where they had spent Christmas Eve together, Grace Conley married Wallace Boone. Margaret was her witness. Eli gave her away, which he did with a gruffness that did not hide the fact that he was genuinely moved. Robbie and Pete wore their Sunday shirts and argued in whispers throughout the ceremony about which of them had had the greater role in facilitating the whole thing. Wallace's ranch foreman, a big steady man named Dak Harris, stood as his witness, and a handful of ranch hands and townspeople filled the small church. Wallace wore his best shirt, which was dark blue, and he had gotten a haircut, and he stood at the front of the church with the particular uprightness of a man who is taking a very serious and deeply wanted thing very seriously. When Grace walked in on Eli's arm in her dress, not a white dress, which was not practical for the time and place, but a deep blue dress the color of the April sky that Margaret had helped her make from good cloth they had ordered from the supply catalog, Wallace looked at her with an expression that was so open and unguarded that it made Dorothea Vance, the schoolteacher, reach for her handkerchief. The minister asked the words, and they said the answers, and when he said, "You may kiss your wife," Wallace kissed her exactly as he had kissed her the first time, with the same careful deliberateness. And everyone who was watching knew they had witnessed something real. After the small reception at the parson's house, where Margaret had produced a wedding cake of remarkable ambition, and the two boys had consumed their weight in it, Grace and Wallace drove together in the ranch wagon to the Harlan Ranch, where Wallace had prepared the foreman's cabin. He had been promoted 6 months prior and had not told her until 2 weeks before the wedding because he hadn't wanted it to be a factor in her decision for their new home. It was a solid cabin, better than the one in Mobedi had been, with glass windows and a proper stove and a good floor, and someone had put wildflowers in a jar on the table. "Who put the flowers there?" Grace asked. Wallace looked at the flowers. "Dak, probably," he said. "He has more sentimentality in him than he would ever admit." She looked around the cabin. It was small but real. It had the quality of something that could become something larger. She turned to her husband, which was a word that settled into her with a rightness she had not expected to feel again so completely, and she said, "We're going to need more shelves." He laughed. It was a full, easy laugh, and she put her hand on his chest to feel the sound of it, and he wrapped both arms around her and held her in the April evening light, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and let herself simply be there in this new right thing without reaching past it or pulling away from it. "We'll build more shelves," he said. "We'll build a lot of things," she said. "Yes," he said, "we will." Life on the Harlan Ranch was work, which Grace had expected and which did not intimidate her. She had worked alongside Thomas on the Mobedy Ranch, and she knew the rhythm of ranch life, the early mornings and the physical demands, and the way the land imposed its requirements regardless of what you had planned. But the Harlan Ranch was larger and better run, and Wallace's position as head horseman meant they had more stability than she had had with Thomas. It was not wealth, but it was solid, which Grace valued more. She made the cabin into a home with the same efficiency she had brought to the store, organized, practical, with small touches that made it beautiful in the way that useful things are beautiful. She kept a kitchen garden. She kept a careful account of the household. She also kept her hand in at the Parsons store, riding into town with Wallace on supply days and spending a few hours with the accounts, because Eli had been happy to have her work reduced but not to lose it entirely, and because Grace had discovered that she liked having something that was hers outside of the domestic. Wallace watched her build this life with the same attention he brought to everything. He told her once early on that watching her work was one of his favorite things, not because he was watching her in any idle or possessive way, but because the quality of her engagement with whatever she was doing was something he found genuinely admirable. "You're entirely present in everything you do," he said. "Most people are somewhere else half the time." "I had to learn that," she said. "After Thomas died, I kept going somewhere else in my head to places where things had gone differently. I had to teach myself to stay where I actually was." He was quiet for a moment. "The Crossroads," he said. "Yes. Even before the Crossroads, sitting there all afternoon going somewhere else in my head. And then the crying, which was the somewhere else becoming unbearable, I think. And then you sat down and you were so completely present yourself that it pulled me back into where I actually was." She paused. "You probably didn't know you were doing that." "I just knew you needed someone to stay," he said. "It was more than that," she said. "It was the way you stayed. Like being there was the most natural thing in the world. No agenda, no exit strategy, just present." He reached over and took her hand. "I'm glad I rode that road instead of the other one," he said. "So am I," she said. By September of that first year, Grace knew she was expecting a child. She told Wallace on a Sunday morning in the good light that came through their east window, and she watched his face go through several things very quickly: surprise, then something stunned and almost fragile, then a smile so wide and complete that it looked like it might stay on his face permanently. He stood up from the breakfast table and came around and crouched down beside her chair and took both her hands and looked at her with those gray eyes full of something so genuine it made her throat tight. "Are you certain?" He said. "Pretty certain," she said. "Margaret confirmed it last week. I wanted to be sure before I told you." "You've known for a week," he said. "I wanted to be sure," she repeated. He shook his head once, not in frustration but in the manner of a man whose heart is doing something large and complicated. He raised her hands and pressed his lips to the backs of them, which was not a thing she had seen him do before, and it was so tender that she had to look away for a moment at the window and the September morning outside. "I'm going to be a father," he said, like he was trying the words out. "You are," she said. "Lord," he said. "Yes," she agreed. He stood up and pulled her up with him and held her with great care, as if she had suddenly become more valuable, which she had. "Wallace," she said against his shoulder. "Yes." "I'm not fragile. You don't have to hold me like I'll break." "I know," he said. "I'm holding you like this because I want to." She settled into it. "All right then," she said. Their son was born in May of 1884 in the same cabin where the wildflowers had been in a jar on their wedding night, delivered by the Lubbock doctor who made the 12-mile ride without complaint. Margaret was there, and she was efficient and calm, and afterwards she sat in the rocking chair in the corner of the cabin and held the baby while Grace rested and looked at Wallace, who was sitting on the edge of the bed with the expression of a man who has just been entirely reorganized by something he had not fully understood until this moment. "He's got your eyes," Grace said. Wallace looked at the baby in Margaret's arms, a solid, serious-looking infant with a full head of dark hair and apparently gray eyes already visible. "You think?" "The color, yes, very clearly." Wallace looked back at Grace. He looked like someone had taken him apart and put him back together in a better configuration. "Thank you," he said. "It was a simple thing, but it carried everything." "Don't thank me," she said. "You were here for every part of it." "I mean for all of it," he said. "For being at that crossroads, for letting me sit down, for saying yes, for all of it." She reached up and touched his face, and he turned his face into her hand like Cricket used to do, that instinctive lean toward something trusted. "What are we naming him?" she said. They had discussed names for months. They had a list. But now, looking at this specific small person with his serious face and his gray eyes, she found she wanted to ask again from the beginning. "Thomas," Wallace said. He had never suggested it before. He said it now with care, watching her face. She was quiet for a moment. Her throat did the thing again. "You want to name our son after my first husband," she said. "He was a good man who built something even if it didn't last," Wallace said. "And he gave you 3 good years and a resilience that brought you to that crossroads and to me. I think he deserves to have someone carry his name who'll do it honor." She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "Thomas Wallace Boone." He nodded. "That's a good name," he said. Thomas Wallace Boone came into the world knowing he was thoroughly wanted, and in the early years he rewarded this assurance by being the most amiable of babies, and then the most curious of toddlers, investigating everything within reach with a thoroughness that required constant supervision. He had Wallace's gray eyes and Grace's dark hair and his own very particular stubbornness, which appeared to be self-generated and could not be attributed to either parent without acknowledging that both were stubborn people and had perhaps merely combined their capacities. Wallace proved to be the kind of father Grace had known. He would be present, patient, engaged. He did not disappear into the work or the bunkhouse. He came home in the evenings and sat on the cabin floor with his son and taught him, as the boy got older, the names of horses and the names of stars and the proper way to hold a rope, and he read to him with the same careful pace with which he had read Dickens aloud, the slow, precise reading that gave every word its due. Grace watched them together in those years with a fullness of feeling that she had no adequate words for. She thought sometimes about the aunt in Nashville who had said Thomas Conley was a dreamer with no money and that Grace was making a mistake. She thought about what she would say to that aunt now. She decided she would not say anything. The life she had built would say it for her. When Thomas was 3, Grace discovered she was expecting again. This time she told Wallace the same day she knew. She had learned that waiting was not always the wiser course. "Another one," he said. "Another one," she confirmed. He smiled that wide, whole-face smile. "Cricket's going to be outnumbered." "Cricket is already outnumbered," she said. "Thomas tried to climb his leg last week." "I know, I watched." Cricket was a gentleman about it. "He's a better-tempered horse than he gets credit for." "Don't tell him that. He likes being thought difficult." This second child, born in the spring of 1887, was a girl, and they named her Ruth, for Wallace's grandmother. She came into the world with an opinion about the arrangements that she expressed at considerable volume from the first moment, and this quality of fierce opinion did not diminish with time. Ruth Boone at 6 months had a way of looking at you that suggested she had assessed the situation completely and found your management of it wanting. Grace recognized this look from her own mirror and found it deeply satisfying to see it in her daughter. They had been at the Harlan Ranch for 4 years, and it had been good years, but in the winter of 1887, Mr. Harlan, who was getting on in years and whose sons had gone to Abilene and shown no interest in returning to work horses, came to Wallace with a proposition. "I'm selling off," he said, which was a plain way to put a significant thing. "The land, the stock, the buildings, everything. My boys want their money, and I don't blame them, and I can't run this place alone." He looked at Wallace across the desk in the ranch office. "But I want it to go to someone who will keep doing what we've done here. Good horses, honest work." He pushed a paper across the desk. "I'll sell to you, not for what I could get from the land companies, but for what's fair between men who have worked together well." Wallace looked at the paper for a long time. He looked at the number. "I don't have this," he said. He was honest about it. "No, but the bank in Lubbock knows you and your account there is clean, and I'll put in a word myself." Harlan folded his hands on his desk. "You've been running this ranch for 4 years, Boone. You know every horse on it and every fence post. It's already yours in all the ways that matter. I'm just asking you to make it official." Wallace rode home that evening and found Grace in the kitchen putting supper together with Ruth on her hip and Thomas building something out of sticks and wool in the corner that he refused to explain. He stood in the doorway for a moment looking at the three of them and the cabin that had become, through 4 years of daily living, so entirely theirs that he could not imagine how he had occupied it before she was in it. "Harlan wants to sell," he said. "To me. The whole ranch." Grace set Ruth down in the pen they kept in the kitchen corner and turned around and gave him her full attention, which was the thing he loved most about her, that she was always genuinely present. He told her the number. She thought about it for precisely the amount of time that was needed and no more. "Can we get the loan?" "Harlan thinks so, and he'll back it." "Then we should do it," she said. "It's a risk," he said. "If the horses don't sell, if the market—" "Wallace," she said. "Is there anyone in the Panhandle who knows horses better than you?" He was quiet. "Is there?" she pressed. "No," he said with no false modesty, because there wasn't. "Then the market will be what it is, and you will work the horses the way you always have, and we will have a ranch," she said. "Our ranch, Thomas and Ruth's ranch." She looked at him steadily. "We should do it." He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and kissed her, which made Thomas look up from his stick construction and make a sound of elaborate disgust, and then go back to his building. The loan was approved. The papers were signed. In March of 1888, the property was officially named the Boone Ranch, which Grace thought had a fine sound to it, and which Thomas, who was now nearly 4 years old and had opinions about everything, agreed was an excellent name because it had his name in it, which Grace explained was not quite what it meant, and which Thomas accepted with the air of someone who had decided not to argue the point. The years that came after were full ones. Running a ranch was different from working on one, and the difference was the scope, the hiring, the finances, the decisions about which horses to breed and which to sell, the management of the range and the fencing and the water and all the 1,000 daily negotiated agreements between a piece of land and the people trying to make something of it. Grace took on the financial management, which she was better suited for than Wallace anyway, and which she enjoyed with the same satisfaction she had taken from the store accounts. Wallace ran the horses and the hands. Together, they made a working whole. They hired 3 men in the first year, a wrangler named Cord, who was young and reliable and had a gentle hand with the young horses, and a pair of brothers named McAllister who knew cattle and fencing, and were willing to work for fair wages and fair treatment, which was all they had ever asked, and all they had too often not gotten. Wallace treated his men well, which Grace had known he would from the day he had offered her his blanket at the Crossroads. There were hard years mixed in with the good ones. The drought of 1890 was the worst thing the Panhandle had seen in a decade, and they lost 2 of their best horses to the heat and a third to a fence accident, and the grass burned down to nothing across the flat and the air tasted of dust. Wallace came home from a full week of 15-hour days looking like he had been put through something, and Grace fed him and sat with him in the evening after the children were asleep and did not try to make it better than it was. "We'll make it through," she said. "I know," he said, "but I feel it." "Of course you feel it. It's your work and your land and your animals. You'd be a different kind of man if you didn't feel it." He looked at her across the table. "You always know the right thing to say." "I know you," she said. "That's different from knowing the right thing to say." He reached across and took her hand. "When I was at the crossroads," he said, "and I decided not to ride past, you almost rode past," she said. "I almost rode on the other road," he said. "I thought about it for a second, and then I heard you and I couldn't." She looked at him. "You never told me that." "I didn't want you to think you nearly, Wallace." She held his hand more firmly. "Tell me true things even when you think they might be hard. We agreed on that." "Yes," he said. "We did." He turned her hand over in his. "I almost rode past, and then I didn't, and I think that was probably the best decision of my life." "Not probably," she said. "Definitely." "Definitely," he agreed. The drought broke in the fall, and the grass came back slow but certain the following spring, and the ranch recovered, and the horses they sold that year were the finest they had produced, trained with the particular patience and honesty that was Wallace Boone's signature method, and that buyers had learned to recognize. Thomas, growing up on a horse ranch, took to horses the way some children take to music, with a natural affinity that looked effortless from the outside, and was the result of 1,000 small devoted hours. By the time he was 8, he could handle a young horse with a steadiness that made the ranch hands shake their heads admiringly. He had his father's patience and his mother's directness, and his own particular quality that was neither, a kind of quiet courage that manifested in the ability to be still in uncertain situations until the uncertain thing resolved itself. Ruth was the opposite of still. Ruth at 5 was a force of nature in a dress, with opinions about everything and the vocabulary to express them, and no apparent interest in keeping either the opinions or the vocabulary to herself. She was brilliant in the peculiar way of children who have read everything they can get their hands on before they are technically old enough to be expected to read it. She had read Wallace's battered Shakespeare by the time she was 6, and had corrections for the minister's sermons by the time she was 7, which she delivered in writing because Grace had impressed upon her that verbal delivery of criticisms during church was not acceptable behavior. The written delivery was not much better received, but at least it was quieter. Grace watched both of them with the same alert appreciation she brought to everything. She thought sometimes about what it would mean to them, this ranch, this life, these particular parents. She wanted them to know what had built it, not the work, though the work was real, but the truth underneath, that their father had stopped at a crossroads when he had almost not stopped, and that their mother had been sitting there with nothing left, and that something had passed between two people in the dark that had started everything. She told them when they were old enough. Thomas was 11 and Ruth was 7. On an October evening with the first autumn cold coming in, and the three of them sitting on the porch while Wallace was in the barn settling the horses for the night, and the stars were coming up in the east the way they had on that first evening at the crossroads. "Your father found me crying," she said. "I was sitting at a crossroads with my trunk, and it was getting dark, and I had nothing left in me. I had lost Thomas's father before you were born." She always said it that way, was careful always to say it clearly, because Thomas deserved to know about his namesake, and I had lost the land, and I was waiting for someone who didn't come, and I had just run out of everything. Thomas was listening with his serious face. Ruth was listening with her whole body tilted toward the story. "And your father rode up and he didn't ask me what was wrong. He just got off his horse and sat down on a rock and stayed." She looked at the stars. "He stayed until I came back to myself, until I remembered who I was." "Who were you?" Ruth asked. Grace looked at her daughter, this small, ferocious, bright, particular person. "I was a woman who had made hard choices and survived hard things and was not done yet," she said. "I had just forgotten it. I needed someone to sit there quietly while I remembered it." Ruth processed this. "And then you fell in love," she said. "Eventually," Grace said. "We were sensible about it." "You weren't that sensible," Ruth said. "You got married 6 months later." "That is sensible for the Panhandle in the 1880s, Grace said. "This is not a region where people take their time." "Why not?" "Because life moves fast and the land is hard and you learn quickly what's worth holding and what isn't." Ruth looked at this with the same evaluating expression she brought to everything. "I think that's practical," she said, "not romantic." It can be both, Grace said. Your father is both. Thomas, who had been quiet through all of this, said, Does it still matter, the Crossroads, since it was a long time ago? Yes, Grace said immediately. It matters every day. Not in the way that I'm still sad at the Crossroads. I haven't been for a very long time. But it matters because it was where everything started. Because your father could have taken another road and he didn't. Because when I was at my lowest point, a good man chose to stay. She looked at her son. That's what built all of this, Thomas thought about it. So what you're saying is that everything started with him just sitting down, he said. Sometimes that's the biggest thing you can do, she said. Just sit down and stay. He nodded slowly. He was his father's son. Wallace came out from the barn then, wiping his hands on his work cloth, and he saw the three of them on the porch and looked at Grace with a question in his face. I was telling them about the Crossroads, she said. He came up the porch steps and settled into the chair beside her, and Ruth immediately shifted from her own chair into his lap because that was the kind of 7-year-old she was, and he wrapped one arm around her and with the other hand found Grace's hand on the arm of the chair between them. The Crossroads, he said. He looked up at the stars. What did you tell them? That you sat on a rock in the dark and waited for me to come back to myself. That's about right, he said. Papa, were you scared? Ruth asked. He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Scared isn't quite right, he said. I was very much hoping things would come out well, for her. Because she was clearly someone who things ought to come out well for. Ruth looked up at him. How could you tell? The way she was crying, he said. He looked at Grace. It wasn't a small sound, it was a big sound, like someone who still had a lot of fight in them and was just temporarily out of ammunition. Grace looked at him. That is the most accurate description of how I felt that I have ever heard. I've had a few years to work it out, he said. Ruth looked between her parents with the expression of someone observing a phenomenon that was both familiar and newly remarkable. You're still in love, she announced, as if this were a discovery. Yes, Wallace said. Very much, Grace said. Ruth considered this, tucked against her father's chest with the October sky spread above them all. I think that's good, she said. So do I, Grace agreed. I think, Thomas said from his chair, in the deliberate voice of an 11-year-old who has been thinking about something carefully for a while, that I would like to be the kind of man who sits down on a rock when it matters. Wallace looked at his son across the porch in the starlight. He looked at him for a long moment. You already are, he said. Thomas thought about this and seemed to find it satisfactory and went back to looking at the stars. The years moved forward the way years do on working land, with a momentum that is larger than any individual day, made of countless small accumulated things. There were seasons of difficulty and seasons of ease, and the particular ongoing happiness of people who have built something real and know how to tend it. Wallace's hair began to go gray at the temples sometime around 1893, which Grace told him made him look distinguished, and which he told her was a generous interpretation that he appreciated. Her own first gray strand appeared the following year, and Wallace kissed the side of her head where he found it and said it was beautiful, and he meant it, because he meant everything he said, which was one of the lasting qualities she loved most in him. Thomas, at 14, was already as good with horses as most grown men, and it was clear enough that the ranch would have a natural successor. Ruth, at 10, had shifted her ambitions from educating the minister to wanting to attend a proper school, and Grace began a correspondence with the school in Abilene that had recently begun accepting girls as well as boys, a development that struck Grace as something the entire country had been long overdue in arriving at. The correspondence was promising. In the spring of 1895, a letter arrived from Grace's aunt in Nashville, the aunt who had called Thomas Conley a dreamer with no money, who had predicted that Grace was making a mistake in going west. The letter was written with the particular tone of someone who has watched their predictions fail to materialize and is not going to acknowledge this directly but wants to reestablish contact nonetheless. It asked after Grace's health. It mentioned the family in Nashville. It said, very briefly and almost in passing, that it was good to hear she had landed on her feet. Grace sat with the letter for a long time at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning, with the spring light coming through the glass windows that Wallace had replaced 2 years earlier with better ones, and she thought about what to say. She thought about the Crossroads, which she thought about regularly but not painfully. It was not a wound anymore. It was a beginning. She thought about Thomas Conley, who had been a good man and whose name their son carried with pride. She thought about Wallace coming up on Cricket in the late afternoon light, a stranger on a sorrel horse who had taken off his hat and sat on a rock without being asked and stayed without any guarantee of anything. She wrote her aunt back. She was gracious, because she was a gracious woman and her aunt was old now and the distance between them had been long. She described the ranch and the horses and the children. She described her husband, and in describing Wallace she was simply accurate, a good man, a steady man, a man who did the right thing in the small moments as reliably as in the large ones. She said she was happy, which was true, and that the panhandle had given her more than it had taken, which was also true, and that she hoped her aunt was well. She did not say, "You were wrong." She did not say, "See." She did not need to. The letter itself, with its fullness and its quiet confidence, said everything that needed to be said. She sealed the letter and walked it out to the mail box at the road's edge and put it in and walked back along the path between the house and the road that she had walked 10,000 times in the years they had been here. And she looked at the ranch, the house they had expanded twice now, the barn, the paddocks full of horses of various ages, the winter wheat coming green in the kitchen garden, the blue panhandle sky enormous overhead, and she felt a satisfaction so complete that it had no sharp edges anywhere. Wallace was at the paddock fence watching a young horse move, his arms on the top rail, his attention entirely on the animal. He did not look up until she was close enough that he heard her footsteps, and then he turned his head and saw her and smiled. Not the wide, full smile, not the surprised, delighted smile, but the small, specific smile he had for her alone, the one that said he was glad she was there, that she was the thing that made the view complete. "Let her to Nashville," he said. "Yes." She came to the fence beside him and put her own arms on the top rail and looked at the young horse, which was a fine gray 3-year-old with a quality about it that reminded her of the horse Wallace had told her about in December of 1882, the one that was afraid of geese. "Is it the first one?" he asked. "From me." "She wrote last month." He was quiet a moment. "Good," he said. "I thought so," she said. "People should be in contact with their families when they can. Even difficult families, especially," she said, "because the difficult ones are usually frightened ones." He looked at her. "You've gotten more generous with them over the years." "I've gotten more comfortable with myself over the years," she said. "It's easier to be generous when you're not defending anything." He nodded, his eyes on the horse again. "She's almost ready," he said, meaning the gray. "She's beautiful. She's going to be one of the best we've had." Grace watched the horse move, the fluid quality of it, the intelligence in the eye. "Wallace," she said. "Yes. I want you to know I think about it sometimes, the Crossroads." He turned to look at her. "Not with sadness," she said quickly, "just with gratitude and wonder, I suppose, at how things happened, that you took that road and not the other one, that you sat down." She paused. "That's an enormous amount of the life we have." "I know," he said. "Everything good came from you sitting down on that rock." He was quiet for a moment. The gray horse stopped and looked at them both with the large, clear, intelligent eye of a good animal. "Everything good came from you being there to sit down for," he said. "From you being the kind of woman you are that made me want to stay. From you crying big instead of small, so I knew there was still everything left in you." He looked at her. "I didn't do anything at the Crossroads except recognize what was in front of me. That's all I did." She looked at him for a long moment. The spring wind came across the paddock. "That's enough," she said. "Recognizing what's in front of you. That's actually most of it." "You recognized it too," he said. "Eventually." "Eventually," she agreed. He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him at the fence, and they watched the gray horse together in the spring afternoon. The panhandle spread out flat and enormous in every direction around them. That country of long sight lines and honest skies, where nothing hid and everything arrived visible from a great distance if you were paying attention. And Wallace Boone had always been paying attention. And Grace Conley Boone had learned again how to do the same. And together they stood at the fence of the ranch they had built from a rock at a crossroads and watched their gray horse move like something beautiful through the good spring light. Somewhere in the barn, Thomas was talking to one of the yearlings in the quiet, patient way he had learned from his father. Somewhere in the house, Ruth was reading something with great intensity and would emerge shortly to tell them both about it. The supper would need to be started. The accounts needed reviewing. The gray horse needed another 2 months of careful, patient work before she was ready to go to her buyer. There was so much to do, and all of it was theirs, and all of it was real, and every bit of it had started with a man on a sorrel horse taking off his hat in the fading light and sitting down on a rock without being asked and waiting, simply waiting, while a woman at a crossroads found her way back to herself. Grace stood at the fence and felt the weight of Wallace's arm around her and the warmth of the afternoon and the rightness of where she was and who she was standing beside, and she thought, this is what it means to be found, not to be rescued, not to be fixed, but to be sat with until you remember. Until you look at the stars and feel the cold and hear a stranger say your name and say your own name back and know that it still means something. Know that you are still someone. Know that the road keeps going and you are still standing in the middle of it with your feet under you and your whole self intact. She had been Grace Conley at the crossroads, lost and running on empty. She was Grace Boone now on the other side of everything, full as the spring, with her husband's arm around her and her children in the buildings behind her and 15 years of a built life spreading out ahead of her in all directions. She was herself. She had always been herself. She had just needed someone to sit with her in the dark until she remembered it. The gray horse turned its head and looked at them with its clear, large eye, and the afternoon held them all, and there was nothing unfinished, and nothing left out, and nowhere else to be.